Tape is rolling.
Okay. Tell me your name and where you're from.
My name is Newell Bryan Tozzer, and I'm born and brought up in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm many generations of Atlanteans.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood in Atlanta before the war, if you can remember.
Oh, Glenn! Of course I can. I was born December 15th, 1933, at Old Piedmont Hospital, when it was over by the stadium, where the stadium is now, is where Piedmont was before it moved out to Peachtree. And both my mother's and my father's family were old Atlanta families, and they happily married each other. And I came home to a beautiful house in Ansley Park from the hospital to 217 15th Street, which was my great-grandmother Wright's house. My mother was Ellen Hillier Newell, and she married William Wright Bryan. October 12th, 1932, they were married in Atlanta at home. And I went to Spring Street School to kindergarten because we were living in Ansley Park. That's where the puppetry arts is now. And then we moved out to 779 Clifton Road to my grandparents, my Newell grandparents' home, because they were spending a lot of time at the beach. And Daddy and his sister decided to sell Granny Wright's house in Ansley Park, unfortunately. And so we moved out to Clifton Road, and I went to first and second grades at Druid Hill School. And then September 1941, which was the year of Pearl Harbor, we moved to 2513 Peachtree Road northeast. And that is where the Gates, those nice condominium, the Gates are located now. Our home was 3 houses north of Lindbergh. And that's where I really grew up. My father was always on the Atlanta Journal. He was rising in the ranks swiftly. And Mother wanted us to go to E. Rivers School because that's where all her friends' children went. So that's where I feel like I really went to school, was E. Rivers, because I went there 3rd through 7th grade, graduating from elementary school. Then I went to Washington Seminary, which doesn't exist anymore. It's part of Westminster now, really. But both my mother and grandmother had gone to Washington Seminary, so I went there to school, to high school. That's near Brookwood Station, Peachtree Station.
Tell me what you remember about Pearl Harbor.
Well, it was a Sunday night that we heard about it, and I remember where I was at 2513 Peachtree Road, upstairs in a room. Mother and Daddy were having Sunday night supper company. They had a small group that they got together with every Sunday night. And some of the children came along, too, and so we children were upstairs. And I think we were called downstairs when the news came over. And a friend of mine who was there with us that night, and I still talk about, remember the night of Pearl Harbor, that we were together. I remember, well, I can see the room I was in, which I think was my bedroom then. Anyway, it was an upstairs room in our home. And then at school the next day, I went to E. Rivers School, which was really my school for elementary school. And at school the next day, we listened to the broadcast in Congress that was played to us in elementary school. So we were very much aware of it.
What sort of, in elementary school with children that young, what did you all think about it?
We just knew it was a big thing. We knew that something big, a big, scary thing had happened. That's all we knew. I was in 3rd grade. And that's exactly what we knew. It affected our lives, though, certainly. And we didn't realize how much affected our lives were going to be. But we just knew something big had happened.
Tell me about some of the changes in life at home after the war started.
Well, after we went into the war, after America went into the war, there were many, many, many changes. Gas rationing was the one that certainly well, there were many kinds of rationing. Gas rationing was primary, and everybody was assigned a card. And Mother didn't request any more than an A card, which was the smallest amount of gas that you could be allotted, because she just didn't think she should ask for more. I think Daddy had already gone to the war by this time. But at any rate, Mother said that she had just enough gas with that A card to go to the store, to the grocery store once a week, and do big marketing once a week, and save as much as she could in case we had to go to the pediatrician, because she had 3 children. I'm the oldest. My sister Mary Lane is 3 years younger than I, and my brother Billy was born in 1940, so he was 1 year old at Pearl Harbor. And she needed to be sure we could get to the pediatrician if we need to. My grandparents, by this time, Mother had moved from Druid Hills, which was a long way away, to the Henry Grady's home on West Wesley. They had a duplex, and my grandparents lived in a lovely half of their home. And we could walk to my grandparents' home there on West Wesley. And we walked to school. We did a lot of walking. It was wonderful to live there on Peachtree Road, so convenient, because we walked to E River School, which is still where it is now. Different school, ours burned down, but we walked to school, we walked to church, we walked up there to West Wesley Road to church. We did a lot of walking. So there was gas rationing, there was shoe rationing. And Mother had 3 little children, and we were growing, constantly growing. So she swapped shoe rationing tickets with my grandmother. And my grandmother gave Mama her shoe rationing tickets, because my grandparents certainly didn't need new shoes much, but they craved butter, and butter was rationed. It was very much rationed, and my Nana loved to make cakes and things with butter, and she would call up Mother and say, "Sister, I just have to have a little butter." So Mother would give her her butter tickets in return for Nana giving Mama the shoe rationing tickets. And then something that just was brought to my mind was that coffee was rationed. Coffee was very scarce and hard to get, and my family's always loved coffee. So it was a great hardship for Mother not to be able to have but 1 or 2 cups of coffee a day. And sometimes you could get some. I remember she would sometimes say that if she got up and went down to the fruit emporium, that she could get a cup of coffee there or something in the middle of the morning. But coffee was rationed. Sugar was rationed. There was a great scarcity of those items.
What type of toys did you play with at the time, and were they even harder to get?
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely. The funny thing about that, Glenn, is that I don't know when it was after the war. I was maybe 12. I was too old, really, for dolls, a little bit too old for dolls. And Mother gave me for that Christmas from Santa Claus the most beautiful, elegant baby doll you've ever seen. And she said, you couldn't get fine. It was a Madame Alexander doll. I remember the brand, which was a very fine doll. And she said you couldn't get dolls, good dolls, during the war. And I just wanted you to have one. I think she wanted to have it herself. But, so toys were hard to get. I mean, rubber, rubber was rationed. Tires, rubber, all rubber was rationed. So anything with rubber in it was hard to get. As you can imagine, it didn't hit me. It didn't bother me. We read books a lot, so you could still get books. Although I still have some of the wartime books. They were printed on very cheap paper, special wartime books. But at any rate, I didn't feel the shortage, but my mother felt the shortage of the toys. She wanted to give them to us.
You were talking about your mom saving gas for the pediatrician. To your memory, was it more difficult to get medicine and medical attention in that time?
What can I say? Penicillin was just invented with the war and during the war, and that was the first use of penicillin. But what can I say? Because we were still so blessed in those days, the pediatrician would come to our home sometimes. I think they did it for everybody, but he was an old family friend. And we didn't have to go to his office all the way like you do now. My children have to take their children to the pediatrician's office always, but he came to our home if we were sick. So we had wonderful medical care. I know that for the grown-ups, that was the children. For the grown-ups, most of the doctors who were the right age, shall I say, had gone to the war. They were with the Emory unit, or they had gone to the war. And my grandfather was old and had Parkinson's disease at that time, and so some of the retired doctors who were his friends took over his care. I know that. But so retired doctors had to come out of retirement with the war.
When did your dad go off?
He had wanted to go in the Army. He was commissioned in the Army because he kept up his commission from college, from Clemson, and there was some minor health problem that wouldn't let him go. And so he convinced his boss, Governor Cox, the owner of the Atlanta Journal, the papers were separate those days, to send him over to England as a war correspondent. And he went over in September of 43. And he sailed on a convoy. Mother went with him to New York to see him off and spent a week or so at the Waldorf. Before his convoy left, she couldn't go down to the convoy, but she went up to New York to see him off. The convoy took weeks and weeks to get to England, and he was in London. That fall, my father had always had a radio program on WSB here in Atlanta called Views of the News, and he had that once a week, and he interviewed interesting visitors to Atlanta, and so people were used to seeing him on the radio. So you didn't have television in those days. Radio was our medium. So when he went to England, he not only wrote columns about Georgia boys, he looked up all these Georgia boys and Georgia heroes in all over England to interview, but he also interviewed them on the radio, maybe 2 nights a week from London. And I have pictures of an advertisement that was in the newspapers about his program, which would be on twice a week from London, saying London Calling, Wright Bryan London Calling. And so he was on NBC and then the build-up began for D-Day. And so he who had promised Mother he would be home at Christmas when he left in September persuaded his bosses to keep him over there for D-Day.
what did he tell you and your siblings when he left?
That he'd be back for Christmas. He planned to be, but it got too much of a big story over there. My father was a real good reporter. He was a real reporter, and it got too much of a big story for him to leave it. And so he stayed and got the biggest scoop of his life.
We'll come back to that in just a second. While he was in England, there for the build-up, tell me about what kind of contact you had with him, letters and such.
Frequent letters, and I've just been rereading them. Wonderful, wonderful frequent letters. Our family's always written letters, and I miss letters now. There was no such thing as a telephone call, but lots and lots of letters, both to the family, as the whole family, and to individuals in the family. I just reread one to me on my 11th birthday that was just beautiful. That's what reminded me of coffee, because he said that coffee was so scarce in England, too, and that he was going to have a second cup of coffee, which was rare, to celebrate my birthday. We sent clippings back and forth. Mother did a good job of clipping the Atlanta papers of all the stories that he needed to read and sent them to him. And then my sister and I were very interested in then Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose, and he sent us stories from the London paper about the royal family. That was our contact.
Tell me about his big scoop.
Well, he was a very, very lucky reporter, war correspondent. He drew, the luck of the draw, he drew to fly over from an airfield in England, to fly over across the channel with the first paratroopers that were dropped in Normandy, the very first paratroopers that were dropped. So he had an eyewitness account of the paratroopers dropping, and a fabulous eyewitness account. And then he flew back to England on that same plane and had written his story, his eyewitness account, had written this account and had it censored. Everything, that's another interesting thing, even our letters had to be censored. I just saw the censored sign on a letter. Had his eyewitness account censored by the censors and approved, and he was ready to go on the air with it before they were ready to go on the air, the radio in those days, with the announcement by Churchill and Eisenhower that D-Day had begun. He was all ready to go on. So as soon as the canned announcement, recorded announcement of the officials, the high officials announcing D-Day had gone on and had played, my father's eyewitness account came on. They called Mother from WSB at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., middle of the night, and said, Ms. Bryan, D-Day has begun, and Mr. Bryan is going to go on the air with the first eyewitness account. I happened to be spending the night round the corner on West Wesley Road with my grandparents, and she called me up, and her mother, and my grandmother called up her sisters, and we called up people, and everybody got up at 3 a.m., whatever time it was, and listened. And it was very exciting. But he was a very, very lucky man. And then, because he was the only eyewitness account, and the others were not back, the other reporters were not back with eyewitness accounts, the networks pooled, and all of them used my father's account. CBS, Mutual, ABC, those were the networks in those days. And they all used my daddy's eyewitness account. And so it went all over the United States of America, not just not just the NBC stations, everybody used it, and it really made him famous.
What was going through your mind, and what emotions were playing through your head when you were listening to that broadcast?
Great pride, just great pride, astonishment, pride, tremendous pride. That's the biggest emotion. You know, we had been listening to him interviewing Joe Blow from Georgia and soldiers from Georgia and people, and that was exciting, but this was remarkable. And on the day of D-Day, the 6th of June, in Atlanta, all the churches had services. And we went to church, and Governor Cox had sent Mother 3 dozen, I think it was a huge amount, of American Beauty red roses. And Mother took them to church and gave them out to some ladies at church. It was a very moving day.
Do you remember your mom's reaction when she was listening?
Yes, pride. You know, I have the front page of the Journal, and I think you've seen it. And there's a little story down in the corner of the front page, and it said, "Proudest woman in Georgia is Ellen Bryan." So, you know, he was famous, and we became famous. And so,
well, what happened to him after D-Day?
he went over into France and fought the battle of getting up to Paris, and was one of the first war correspondents to enter Paris, the day of the liberation of Paris in August 1944. And then he continued on. This is a story about the Ghost Corps awarding him an honorary, making him an honorary member of the Ghost Corps, a famous brigade that he was with. And by that time, he had been captured by the Germans. He was captured near Nancy, France. And he was with 3 other war correspondents, 2 other war correspondents, and a jeep driver. And they were going to cover a mass surrender of Germans. And they got waylaid ambushed down a road by some people who were they had stolen the uniforms of the Free French. And when they went down this road, Daddy was shot in the leg. And I guess they'd gotten out of the Jeep, and Daddy was shot in the leg. And fortunately, one of the war correspondents spoke perfect German. He had been a reporter, a top-notch reporter in Berlin before the war. And so he could shout in perfect German to them, "We are unarmed," wave a white handkerchief or something, "We are unarmed war correspondents, quit shooting." But Daddy had been injured in the left leg by that time. And so he was in a German prison camp for the rest of the war.
Did you have any contact with him after that point?
There was no direct contact while he was in the prison camp. And that was very scary and frustrating. Scary to Mother, because he did not have a dog tag. War correspondents didn't have a dog tag, a serial number, and since he didn't have that, there was no way to send news of him through the regular channels. So my mother, who was a very brave woman, went down to a hotel downtown here and camped out on the doorstep of a man named Basil O'Connor, who was head of the American Red Cross at that time. And she got him to send a wire through his channels to find out where Daddy was. The only way that we had heard about his whereabouts was that the wives of men who were in that prison camp would receive letters. And they would say, so-and-so and so-and-so came into the camp today, and Wright Bryan came in. And so then they would look up the number in Atlanta and call Mother and let her know, and that was the way she heard. And then finally Basil O'Connor got something through, but there was never any direct communication from my father.
How soon after he'd been captured did you hear about it?
Right away, because one of these correspondents escaped, and he escaped from the Germans and wrote about it. So we heard, Mother heard right away. She was having dinner one Sunday night with the Biggers, and Mr. Biggers was the head of the journal. He was the business manager of the journal in those days. And he and his wife had taken Mother out to dinner with a visiting dignitary, and he was called away to the phone, and Mother came back. He came back to the table, and Mother said she could tell something was the matter, because the conversation just went flat after that. Nothing gelled. It wasn't funny. It wasn't. And on the way home, taking my mother home, he told her that he had received a wire from this man who escaped. Wright Bryan was a prisoner, and he'd been shot in the leg. He was all right, but he'd been shot in the leg. But he was very, so it was, in the newspapers, a big story.
What went through your head when you heard about that?
Fear, but one thing I have to tell you was that one of the reasons I think my mother was such a brave lady, incredibly brave lady, was that she never let us children be afraid that Daddy was not coming back. She just instilled in us the hope and the belief that he would be home just fine. Some of Mother's friends were very dubious that he would get home and were really worried. And Mother didn't let that rub off on her. She was courageous and didn't let us children worry about it at all. We just had faith that Daddy would be home, and eventually he was in July of 45 or August of 45.
Tell me about VE Day from your point of view.
Well, I remember the celebration. I don't remember exactly what I did. I really don't remember what I did, but I do remember it was a celebration. It was, by that time Daddy was home, and I remember that it was a happy time. I've thought of some other things, Glenn, that I should tell you about the war. We all had victory gardens, and grew as much as we could, vegetables and whatever. Vegetables, of course. And then, it's the only time Mother ever did this with us, and we did it together, and we children worked with her. We went out to the big farmer's market and canned and preserved and put up tomatoes and succotash and okra and things to eat all winter. We did a lot of that kind of thing during the war with victory gardens. And then we saved things like tin cans. It was long before the days of recycling, but they were used in the war effort. And we children saved tin foil from things like chewing gum wrappers and things. We'd carefully save the tin foil and roll it into a big ball, and that was part of the war effort. And we knitted squares for for the Red Cross to make Africans out of. We knitted squares as much as we could. We were all involved in the war effort in various ways.
Tell me about the day your dad came home.
Oh, Mother had gone to New York to meet him. She had gone up on the train to New York to meet him, and she wasn't back from New York yet. When he was flown into Lawson General Hospital, that's out in Chambly, I don't think Lawson General exists now, but it was a big facility out there, lots of Quonset huts and things. And he had spent a couple of months in Paris after he was liberated, in the first General Hospital, having his leg operated on because it needed attention. And friends of Mother's, who were her good friends, who were members of the War Widows Poker Club with Mother. Mother's entertainment on Saturday night, which she never did before the war or after the war, was to get together with these ladies and play poker on Saturday night. And she said it kept her sanity to get together with some grown-ups on Saturday night. Anyway, several of them drove my sister and my brother and me out to Chambly, to Lawson General, to meet Daddy when he came in on the plane. And this is a picture of my sister and my brother and me the day he got home from the war. And Mother didn't get home until the next day from New York on the train, but she had met him in New York. And it was a tremendous celebration, of course. And almost as soon as he got home, I think as soon as he got home, he was made the top editor of the journal. He was managing editor when he left, and he was made the editor of the journal when he returned.
Tell me about the decoration that General Eisenhower gave him.
He was awarded, my father was awarded the Medal of Freedom by General Eisenhower. And that's the highest award that a civilian can be given in this country. And it was made for his wartime services, and his being in the prison camp was mentioned. And it's a tremendous distinction and award. And there was a little bar of ribbons that my father always wore in his lapel for big occasions, for dress-up occasions and things. That was the Medal of Freedom. He admired General Eisenhower a lot, of course. So,
what effect do you think that? What effect did the World War II years have on you personally?
It was formative. You know, it was a formative time. My father became famous. My mother was valiant. There's no other word for it besides valiant. And kept everything together and was a wonderful, valiant manager of the home front. Oh, she was, by the way, I didn't mention, did I? There was a blackout here in Atlanta. We had a blackout. And Mother was an air raid warden who went around the block checking to be sure that all of the lights were, or at least that there were these blinds that kept the lights from showing. And she walked all around our block, patrolling for that. And Mother had a lady friend who said, "Ellen, you've got room now that Wright's gone to the war." And she insisted we take in 2 WACs, this is the Women's Army Corps, to live with us at our home on Peachtree Road, because there just was a shortage of rooms here in Atlanta. And Atlanta was, we thought it was big, but it was a much smaller city then, and very safe. And so we had these two whacks living with us, and actually Mother moved out of her own bedroom, and because it had a private bath, and she moved into a company room. And we kept up with them for years and years to come. But it was a formative time, and a never to be forgotten time. And my father made so many friends among the famous war correspondents and people in England who came and visited us after the war, that we became sort of an international, Daddy called it Bryan's Billeting Bureau. All these people were put up in our house when they came to Atlanta. It was exciting, It was an exciting home to grow up in, and I had an exciting mother and father.
Tell me about how Atlanta changed from 1941 until after the war.
Oh, it grew so much, just tremendously. The Bell Bomber plant made for great growth of this town, bringing all these people to work in the Bell Bomber plant, as well as the military people who came to town. And it grew tremendously during the war. Daddy and Mother were great friends of Margaret Mitchell's, and she'd gone to high school with Mother, and she'd worked on the newspaper with Daddy. And he wrote a column after the war for the paper when he was editor. He wrote a column 5 days a week. And one time she came up to Mother in the store and said, "Ellen, I have an idea for a column for Wright. I want you to, this is the column I want you to write. I want him to tell them to go home. I want him to tell all the people who came here during the war to go home, that we needed them during the war, and we had to have them during the war. But now," she said, "I can't find a parking place. And tell Wright to tell them to go home." So it made it into a major city. We thought it was big before because it was the capital of Georgia, and it was big, but it just grew.
What with all of the school-age kids that are going to be in the exhibit and see this video, and future generations, what do you want them to know and understand and remember about the sacrifices that were made during World War II?
I think that I would want them to know that we thought it was necessary, that we all thought this was a necessary part of winning the war, and that we were all a part of the effort. None of us complained. Mother didn't complain about having an A card. We didn't complain about not having sugar. Somehow we got shoes. We all thought it was necessary, and that we were all, I was a child, but we were all part of the war effort. And we liked being part of the war effort because we knew it was crucial. So I would want them to know that the country was unified and determined, and we wanted to win the war, and we knew we needed to do this to do it.
That's about all the questions we've got. Have we? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to address?
Mm-hmm. Oh, did you get that picture?
Didn't get you holding it, and let me get you to hold that, and you can point to us who everyone is and what you're doing and everything.
This is a picture that was in the Atlanta Journal on D-Day. As I said, in those days, we had the radio, period. There was no television. So the radio was what we listened to all the time. And this is my mother. This is my younger brother, Billy Bryan, in a Navy uniform. This is my sister, Mary Lane Bryan Sullivan now. And here I am. We are gathered around big old radio. The radios were so big in those days. This was a radio and a Victrola. And my daughter Ellen has taken the radio out, of course, and made it into a piece that she has in her dining room. Anyway, it's a big old radio. So here we were, a mother and her 3 children, gathered around the radio, listening to my daddy on D-Day. And here's a picture of my daddy right there on top of the radio. And a friend of Daddy's at the newspaper called up after he saw this picture, called up Mother and said, "Ellen, that picture is so corny, it's good." So corny, it's good. But there we were, and we were, D-Day was in the middle of the night, so we weren't really listening to the D-Day broadcast, but we were listening to the radio as we did frequently. He was on every Sunday, for instance, and so we would listen to that very radio on Sunday. But it's a family group.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's perfect.
Anything else?
I don't think so. I think that's it. I think that is an excellent interview, which we'll be able to use a lot of.
Good.
So, thanks, guys.
All right.
Wonderful.
I think that did okay.
That was wonderful.